Good morning. I'm going to start with a story that will feel all too familiar to so many of us in this current COVID-19 sheltering in place thing that we're doing. There was a man who worked for this company. He was the manager of a department, and then he had been out doing some things, and on Friday, at the end of the day, he comes into his office and just kind of straightening things up and getting things set for Monday, and then he sees this envelope on his desk. And he opens up the envelope, and it's basically him being told that he's being fired. In it also mentions that not only is he being fired, but his whole department is being fired, and his entire office in that city is being closed. And you can imagine, especially if you've experienced it, what he was going through. He sat there and said, oh man, all of the years I've put into this company, and and then it proceeds to just being angry. Couldn't believe that this is going on, feeling resentment, and then of course the anxiety and fear starts to creep in. He starts thinking of all of the terrible things that could happen to him in the coming weeks and months. And of course, he's at that certain age where he's a little bit, as a baby boomer, I know a lot of baby boomers who face this. You get over the age of 50, suddenly places are a little reluctant to hire you. So he starts thinking about that. And then, of course, that sense of like, was he disposable? So many, the question of are we an essential employee or not? The way that word's been thrown around here in recent weeks. Would he have to sell his house? So he just sat there for hours, just kind of working this all through. And then at one point, he kind of brings his thoughts back to the present moment, and across his desk is crawling a spider. And without even really thinking about it, he brushes the spider off of the desk. And then he watches in amazement how the spider does what spiders do. Suddenly he shoots out a strand of his webbing and just kind of gracefully lands on the ground. And the man was watching this and thinking, well, I've just kind of been brushed off of my job. And if this little creature has the resources within him to do what he just did, what's within me? What can I do? He started thinking about what he would do next. And of course, one of the things we teach in Unity, especially with the How to Live a Prosperous Life, is what do you love to do? And so he's thinking, about how he's always enjoyed writing, and he would do some writing on the side. But now suddenly he had more time on his hands, so he really dove into his writing. And sure enough, he was able to earn a living. I mean, he didn't, become some famous author or anything like that, but he was able to get enough writing done and get paid for it that he essentially doubled what he was making in that old office job, and was able to save more for his retirement than he would have there before. So what happened? He started to recognize that security wasn't his job. Security was knowing that he had the resources to handle whatever happens. The word secure comes from two Latin words. The first, sec, meaning without, and cure, meaning without care. So in other words, secure means freedom from anxiety. Notice, though, that he went through the layers of grief that all of us go through, regardless of what kind of loss we've had in our life, whether it's a loss of a person, a loss of a job, a loss of a way of life, a loss of our routine. And so many of us have actually been processing the grief of our daily and weekly routine just being upended. For those of you who aren't familiar with the layers of grief, the first one is just shock, and sometimes shifting into denial that there's any problem here. Then you start getting in that place where you're feeling angry, like this gentleman. It's like, how could this company do this to me? And then there's bargaining. You start, well, if I do this, can I keep my job? That sort of thing. Whatever it is, you're bargaining with God or bargaining with other people. Well, if I just do this, I remember at one point, having a girlfriend that I broke up with, and she said, will you stay with me if I lose some weight? And I remember at the time thinking, I've never had any concern about your weight, but it started to give me a sense of that inadequacy she felt within herself. So where's the inadequacy in you? What are you feeling that you're not up to doing? So there's shock and denial, angering or bargaining, and then there's guilt. It's like, if I just done this differently, then this would have been the outcome rather than this being the outcome. And then there's the sadness or depression, where you just get into the point where you're just sitting, maybe staring at your navel, or as I joked last week, someone said, how they're going to use all this extra time to make themselves a better person, and a few hours later they find themselves sitting in the shower eating chocolate ice cream. So what happened? Well, you get into that sadness or depression and talk yourself out of it. And then that last layer of grief is when we emerge from it. We have an acceptance of what's going on, and we're willing to take a new approach to life and just transcend. In other words, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension, the layers of grief. So the title of our lesson is Planning Your Resurrection. Part 2 of our 4-part series on manifesting a recession-proof life. A good practical lesson for you and for the 4 Sundays of this month. These last few months, though, we've gone through remarkable change. Of course, the last few years we've been going through remarkable change, but just think of it. Could you have possibly imagined in January, what you're thinking, feeling, and doing right now? But if we're honest with ourselves, things are always changing. The philosopher Heraclitus built his whole philosophy on the fact that things are constantly changing. In fact, in the Garden of Eden, Adam at one point turned to Eve and said, well, how are we supposed to adapt to this period of rapid and accelerating change? Yeah, we're creatures of habit. We're creatures of routine. So when that gets appended, it's like, we try to cling to those old things. And where is the individual that embraces change without some complaining? But perhaps the change will knock us out of our ruts, our routines, our rituals, and it also gives us an opportunity to look at our decisions. How many of our decisions are influenced by a deep inner feeling of insecurity or fear? Last week I talked about the concept of divine substance, that there's this underlying spiritual energy that can be congealed into physical form here in the physical world. And so when we intuitively are guided as to what it is we need to do, and our imagination is fired, and by that I mean, flares up, and our imagination starts to see what it is we want to demonstrate here in this physical world. And so we kind of call that spiritual substance to come, and through coincidences or connections or whatever, suddenly we start to see our plan unfold in our life, or the thing that we wanted to build being built. We live in a universe of abundant supply. Like there's more than enough food, there's more than enough building materials, there's more than enough money. It's all about our state of mind. Like the theater producer Michael Todd saying, well, I've been broke many times, but I've never been poor. It's all about the attitude. How quickly we can head off fear and thoughts of lack when we have that right state of mind. Like our friend who swept the spider off of his desk. He was able to suddenly shift that whole train of negative thinking that he had and start to think about, but what can I do next? And allowing that guidance to come. We can take the road less traveled and recognize that whatever is happening to us, that we can allow something else to happen through us. Is it possible to have a life that's completely free of insecurity? Well, how do you define insecurity, or how do you define security for that matter? If You see security as walls that protect you, all the food that you need, clothing, shelter, heat, light, medical care that you need. Then the truly secure person is the person with a life sentence in a penitentiary. I don't think we want to do that. True lasting security cannot come in the physical world. As Jesus said, rather than build up your treasures here in this physical world, build up your treasure in heaven. And of course, in heaven, the kingdom of heaven is our growing spiritual awareness, or our growing awareness that we're spiritual beings having a human experience. Once that happens, then anything can happen to us, but it's like I've got confidence, and I place my faith in God and know that a better thing is unfolding for me. That God has kind of come along with that spiritual 2x4 and whacked me on the back of the head to snap me out of my sleepiness to this world. Archaeologists tell us that the early days of life on Earth, that Homo sapiens, in other words, modern human beings, were up against insurmountable odds. They had creatures and beasts that had tusks, hides, claws, wings, shells, tremendous brute strength, but oddly, we're the ones that survived. Logically, you'd think, there's no way we could have survived against those beasts, but we did. And it's because we have the ability to use our imagination to mold this substance and to use our creativity and be willing to take risks. If we weren't willing to take risks, look at all of the stories from our human being heritage, Moses, Columbus, people willing to step out there and go against the common wisdom and being willing to say, no, there's a better way of doing this. So we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And as Jesus told us, seek the kingdom of God first, and all of these things will be brought unto you. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. So people who prosper, and prosper permanently, are people who are willing to take that risk. People who see some sort of a niche or need that they can fill, and they go ahead and do it. And it follows what it is they love to do and what they've got a passion for doing. This is, basically the description of an entrepreneur. Somebody who's willing to start a business or to take an idea and run with it. There was a man in Canada named Ralph Edwards. He lived from 1892 to 1977. He was known as the homesteader, Ralph Edwards, since it's a pretty common name. But he decided at a young age that he wanted to be essentially a mountain man kind of a thing. So he went deep into the wilderness of British Columbia, here early in the 20th century, to just basically see if he could live off the land. Eventually he got married and had kids, and they still lived out in the middle of nowhere in British Columbia. And in some of the books that were written about him, one of the authors asked him, how did you do it? And he said, all I had was a lot of sheer necessity. As a baby boomer, I look at the model that was presented to me, in the late 50s and the 1960s. We'd see so many of our parents work in one job their whole life. And then at the retirement, they'd get a defined benefit pension, and that was what we were supposed to do. But we discovered as baby boomers, no. Society changed on us. That sense of loyalty to the company wasn't there, and the sense of a company's loyalty to its community and to its employees also went out the window. Did your job, the job that you do right now, exist 20 years ago? Through this crisis, so many people are speculating about what the world will be like and what our routines will be like. About a week ago, the conservative newspaper, the Financial Times, this is the newspaper that billionaires and millionaires read, and they look at what's going on in the economy. Their editorial board came to a stunning conclusion, and they wrote an editorial saying it's time to abandon Reaganomics. Time to abandon this conservative mindset, this kind of pseudo-libertarian mindset that we've been experimenting with for the last 40 years. Basically, they said the experiment has failed and that this crisis has really brought it to a head. And they compared the lives of people here on Earth between 1981 and 2020. And they compared it to, say, 1946 to 1980, and how much more secure people felt when there was more of a sense of a social safety net. The challenge is that if we have taken a job, then it's possible that the job can be taken from us. And so we need to know that our job is not our source. Our investments are not our source. Our pensions are not our source. Our Social Security benefits are not our source. These are all channels through which God provides us with what it is we need. But if in our mind we lock down that, okay, this is all that I'm going to be getting, well, that's what we'll get. Whatever we focus on expands. So if you find your mind experiencing anxiety and stress, do what our friend who swept the spider off the desk did. Change your way of thinking and affirm something like, God is the source of my supply, and I am open and receptive to the many channels through which it flows. I'll say that one again. God is the source of my supply, and I am open and receptive to the channels through which it flows. Now, earlier I mentioned entrepreneurs. Somebody comes with an idea and is willing to step out and do it. Yet I've met a lot of people over the years who are kind of like, oh no, I couldn't do that. I need to work for someone else, or I need structure in my life, or whatever. Maybe instead of being an entrepreneur, you can become an intrapreneur. In other words, the letters I-N, intrapreneur. And that is that you're willing to go within and do the work, to change our thoughts, our attitudes about life, our worldview, and know that regardless of what happens, that we'll have the resources to allow us to live a pleasant life. Lifelong learning is no longer a desirable luxury, it's now a vital necessity, with many of us having to change jobs or careers. I started out as a journalist, and then Carla and I set out in the 90s and were out visiting Unity churches all over the continent, teaching the principles of prosperity. And then we ended up going to ministerial school and becoming ministers. We've changed our careers, and that doesn't even count everything that we did before, say, 1980. So you might be thinking, I believe, but I have my doubts. Hey, that's great. Don't worry about it. To try to think that you're going to 100% believe in spiritual principle, I don't know that I've met anybody, and I know I certainly haven't. But all too often a person isn't willing to fess up to their unbelief. Yet Jesus, we know we have the story in the Gospels of Jesus having a Roman centurion come to him. In other words, an officer of the Roman army who were occupying, the Israel and the homeland there. And the centurion wanted Jesus to heal his boy. And Jesus basically asked him, do you believe that your boy can be healed? It's typical Unity stuff. It's like, well, what is it that you believe? And the centurion said, I believe, but help me through my unbelief. And Jesus praised him for fessing up to the fact that he didn't always believe. But I know in my own experience, once I got to the point of conditioning my thinking and my feelings to the point that I knew that 51% of the time I'm thinking positive, 51% of the time I'm feeling prosperous, I have made a major achievement there by getting to that point. Just know that when the negative thoughts do come in, that we now recognize it so much earlier, and then we can let go of it. And then take one of those positive thoughts and ride that forward. There is one thing that does not change, and that is the kingdom of God. That sense that this God presence is always there and never changes. And if we're spiritual beings having a human experience, that means that we are part of this amazing presence that we call God, more powerful than anything else we can imagine, present everywhere in every cell of our bodies. and everywhere around the world and beyond. And that it knows everything. It is the all-knowing mind of God that we can connect our conscious minds to. And that it will provide us at all times with the divine substance to mold and shape what it is we need. So, I'm going to have Duncan put up the slide of the takeaways, and I put this on the Facebook page right there below where you're watching now. So how do we plan our resurrection? Well, we plan our resurrection that knowing that, hey, no matter what happens, we're going to be okay. If we find ourselves asking, how is this going to happen? Remember this affirmation. How is none of my business? How is none of my business? If we recognize that God is working with us and allowing us to have the divine ideas to move forward, we don't need to worry about that. I place my faith in God. Nothing else in this physical world, just place it in God and know that my awareness of this God is growing. I know that God works through me. I recognize that I am a part of God, which means I'm part of the omnipresence, or the presence everywhere. I'm part of the omniscience, the all-knowing mind of God. And I'm part of that omnipotence, the powerful beyond measure aspect of God. So I open my mind to the divine ideas and allow those divine ideas to download. And what do we need to do with divine ideas? Believe that they exist and then be willing to express them. And that's what we call divine guidance. And it comes through our intuition. And then through that intuition and with our understanding and imagination, we hand it off to the thinking and feeling nature, and then they run with it. But too often, that thinking and feeling nature jumps in too early and talks us out of it. So recognize what it is you need to do through that gut feeling. Follow your intuition. And then be open to further guidance. Be open to any further adjustments that you need. So, planning your resurrection. Remember, Easter is a 3-act play: crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. So don't worry so much about the resurrection. Just know that you'll have an ascension. I'm going to close with a 2-minute video about resurrection from Steve Hartman of the CBS Evening News.
Just outside Minneapolis, Brooklyn Park police officers Jeremy Halleck and Tony Weeks were driving around town recently.
Just routine patrol.
When they came across something remarkable.
We just saw a car